What if your entire life, your fate, your health even, the very balance of your mind was sealed long before you were born? What if the blood that coursed through your veins was not a sign of your divine right or your noble status, but a ticking time bomb? For centuries, across continents, royal families held one truth above all others. Blood purity was power. They were obsessed with keeping their lineage concentrated, believing that a tightly woven family tree would guarantee political stability and dynastic control. In pursuit of this power, they made a chilling trade, genetic risk for political might. They performed the most intimate, dangerous experiment in human history, intermarrying generation after generation until their family trees ceased to be trees at all, becoming dense, inbred thickets, twisted beyond recognition. The result was not a pure line, but shattered minds, broken bodies, and the most heartbreaking stories history has to offer. We are not just talking about abstract history here. We are uncovering the profoundly personal, unbelievable, and sometimes truly unsettling stories of history's most inbred women, the queens, princesses, and noble figures who paid the ultimate, biological cost for their family's ambition. By the time we reveal the figure who stands at the absolute zenith of this genetic tragedy, you will be stunned. This is the dark side of royal bloodlines. Before we dive into the catastrophic human examples, we must understand the silent killer that haunted these gilded halls, the coefficient of inbreeding, or simply F. When an individual's parents are related, they are more likely to share the same versions of genes, including the rare, often harmful recessive ones. If you inherit 2 copies of a bad recessive gene, one from each parent, that trait or condition will finally manifest. In a normal population, the odds of this are low, but when cousins marry, those odds skyrocket. The F-score mathematically quantifies this genetic risk. A child born of 2 unrelated parents has an F of 0. A child born of 2 full siblings has an F of 0.25 or 25%, the genetic equivalent of having 1/4 of your entire genome derived from a single common ancestor. In the royal houses, particularly the Habsburgs and the Ptolemies, these numbers didn't just climb, they became exponential. A typical person has 8 unique great-grandparents. As we will see, some royal figures had as few as 4, or even 2. They were literally doubling up on their history, and in doing so, they were doubling up on their hidden genetic weaknesses. The great irony of this royal obsession with pure blood is that they were actually practicing the most aggressive form of genetic degradation. They sought to maintain power by maintaining a closed gene pool, believing that bringing in new blood from lesser houses would dilute their God-given right to rule. But the only thing they diluted was the genetic resilience of their children. The practice of consanguineous marriage, or cousin marriage, was seen as a strategic political tool, a way to merge kingdoms, secure alliances, and prevent the fragmentation of territories. Spain and Austria, 2 great European powers, were ruled by the same family, the House of Habsburg. They were masters of this strategy, and because their empire was so vast, stretching across the globe, they felt they had no equal, no suitable partner who wasn't already a first or second cousin. This incestuous cycle became self-perpetuating, creating a dynasty so rich in gold and land, yet so poor in genetic diversity that it collapsed under its own biological weight. The stories of the women we are about to explore are the physical manifestations of this mathematical, historical, and biological failure. Asterisk, 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 hash, 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 asterisk, asterisk. Case 1. Maria Antonia of Austria, the apex of Habsburg. Inbreeding, asterisk, asterisk. Our journey into the deepest genetic shadows must begin not with the most famous, but with the figure whose coefficient of inbreeding was arguably the highest of any royal in European history, Maria Antonia of Austria. Born in 1669, she was the daughter of Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, and Margarita Teresa of Spain. While her story is often overshadowed, her genetic reality is staggering. Historians and geneticists analyzing the Habsburg pedigree have found that her inbreeding coefficient was calculated to be a monstrous 0.254, even higher than the infamous Charles II of Spain. To put that into perspective, an F-score of 0.25 is, as we noted, the equivalent of a child born to a brother and sister. Maria Antonia's lineage was not a tree. It was, as described, a dense, looping vine where the same names Ferdinand, Maria Philip appeared on every single branch. Her ancestry was so convoluted that she essentially only had 2 or 3 unique lines, feeding into her genetic makeup. But why does history remember her less than her uncle? Because tragedy can be quiet. Maria Antonia was plagued by ill health throughout her life. She was married off to her uncle, Maximilian II Emmanuel, Elector of Bavaria, in a political arrangement typical of the time. But the most profound tragedy was her struggle to produce a viable heir. She had 3 sons, all born with genetic frailty. Her first son, Leopold Ferdinand, died a few months after birth. Her second, Antonio, died within weeks. Her third, Joseph Ferdinand, the great hope for the continuation of the Spanish Habsburg line, survived for 6 years. The potential for him to inherit the sprawling Spanish Empire was enormous, but he too died young, in 1699. It is widely believed that his death was a direct result of the accumulation of lethal, recessive genes passed down through his and his mother's incredibly shallow gene pool. Maria Antonia herself had died in 1692, at the age of 23, likely from complications of childbirth, coupled with a lifetime of poor health. Her short, sad life was the prelude to the complete, catastrophic downfall of the dynasty in Spain. Her death, followed by the death of her son, cleared the path for the tragedy that was her uncle, Charles II of Spain, a man whose physical and mental decline became a political problem for all of Europe, ending the Spanish Habsburg line and plunging the continent into the War of the Spanish Succession. Maria Antonia, the woman who was genetically more compromised than even Charles, stands as the quiet, forgotten warning sign that the Habsburg experiment was failing catastrophically. ###. Case 2, Cleopatra II, Philopator, the Ptolemaic obsession. Moving from the austere courts of 17th century Europe to the sun-drenched ancient grandeur of Hellenistic Egypt, we find an obsession with blood purity that predates the Habsburgs by over 1,000 years. Cleopatra II Philopator, 0M10S59. The legendary Cleopatra VII, the one of Caesar and Antony, gets all the headlines. But it is Cleopatra II who truly embodies the relentless, cold calculus of dynastic inbreeding. The Ptolemies, founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, were Macedonian Greeks who ruled Egypt to legitimize their rule over an ancient land where pharaohs traditionally married their sisters. The Ptolemies adopted the practice, but for them, it wasn't just ritual. It became a political imperative to keep the vast wealth and power of the kingdom strictly within the family. Cleopatra, too, was the living monument to this strategy. Her lineage reads like a deliberate attempt to fold the family tree back on itself. Her parents, Ptolemy V and Cleopatra I, were first cousins, which was mild by Ptolemaic standards. But here is where it gets truly unsettling. Cleopatra to herself eventually married both of her brothers, Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VIII. This complex, often brutal family dynamic meant she was not only queen alongside a brother, but often against him, engaging in civil wars and assassinations that make the HBO series Game of Thrones look like a family picnic. Her life was a dizzying rotation of alliances and betrayals, where her consort was simultaneously her brother, her rival, and often her attempted murderer. The result of this constant brother-sister pairing was a line that, while politically secure for a time, was biologically precarious, though she managed to produce children. The Ptolemies often suffered from genetic weaknesses, mental instability, and physical frailty that worsened over the centuries. Cleopatra II's willingness to engage in this brother-sister marriage, a foundational act of the dynasty, shows that for the Ptolemies, the political and religious justification for inbreeding was so absolute that the potential for deformity or sickness was simply an acceptable risk. She was the very embodiment of the calculated ambition that valued the crown's purity over the human cost. Case 3. Maria, the First of Portugal, the Queen undone by madness. Our next figure is one of the most tragic and haunting royal examples. Maria, the First of Portugal. Known as Maria the Pious, but increasingly and tragically, Maria the Troubled. Born in 1734, she inherited a bloodline already heavily saturated by Iberian intermarriage. Her parents, King Joseph I and Mariana Victoria of Spain, were part of the vast, intricate network of Spanish and Portuguese royalty. Yet, when it came time for Maria to marry, the choice was the most consolidating one possible. She married her own paternal uncle, Peter III. This was a full uncleness marriage, a genetic reality that gave her children an inbreeding coefficient of 0.125. Equivalent to that of a first cousin marriage, but compounded on top of the already existing inbreeding in their shared ancestry. The results were predictable and devastating. She bore several children, but, as the script notes, half of them didn't survive, with genetic complications likely playing a major role. But the most profound tragedy was her own mental decline, while she began her reign as an effective and much-loved monarch. By the early 1790s, the Queen was descending into a profound, terrifying madness. This wasn't just melancholy. Contemporary accounts detail symptoms that sound like acute clinical depression, paranoia, and religious mania. She became increasingly agitated, refused to leave her apartments, and developed an obsessive, almost paralyzing fear of her own death, which manifested in screaming fits and erratic behavior. This mental collapse, which became so severe that she was deemed officially unfit to rule in 1792, was blamed by her doctors on everything from spiritual distress to the death of her beloved husband, uncle, and her eldest son. However, modern medical historians increasingly attribute this level of profound, debilitating mental illness, especially when compounded by a history of child mortality and physical frailty, to the accumulated genetic load from generations of extreme consanguinity. Maria I became the Queen undone, not by war or political rival, but by the invisible toll of her own biological inheritance. Her final years, spent in Brazil after the Portuguese court fled Napoleon, were marked by perpetual torment, a living testament to the dangers of a royal lineage too closely confined. Case 4. Isabella II of Spain, the turbulent, tainted throne returning to Spain. We look at the 19th century Spanish Bourbon queen, Isabella II, whose life was a maelstrom of political instability and genetic compromise. Born in 1830, she inherited a crown steeped in controversy and a gene pool utterly contaminated by generations of intermarriage between the Bourbon and Habsburg lines. Her birth itself was the result of a union between an uncle and his niece, but the true complexity lay in the layering of these unions. Her grandparents on one side were also her great-grandparents on the other, creating a terrifying genetic echo chamber. Her marriage was a political disaster fueled by genetics. At just 16, she was married off to her double second cousin, Francis, Duke of Cadiz. The marriage was a disaster, widely believed to be unconsummated or deeply unhappy. Due to the husband's suspected sexual identity and the Queen's own lack of affection, the consequences were profound. Isabella bore 11 children, yet only 5 lived past infancy. This high rate of infant and child mortality is a classic and clear sign of recessive genetic conditions being expressed in an inbred population. But the story gets even more complicated and fascinating. It is heavily rumored and widely accepted by many historians that her husband, Francis, fathered none of those surviving children. The true father is believed to be one of her various lovers, chosen perhaps out of necessity to ensure the dynasty survived, given the genetic weakness and marital strife. This is the ultimate tragic paradox of the royal bloodline obsession. In the final, desperate act to secure the succession that inbreeding had made so precarious, the pure bloodline had to be abandoned in secret, lest the throne fall vacant or be inherited by a physically or mentally compromised heir. Isabella II's life was not just a grim cost, it was a political spectacle that ended in revolution and her eventual exile. A legacy indelibly marked by the shadows of her family's genetic entrapment. ******. Case 5. Marie-Louise Elizabeth d'Orleans, the tragic Duchess of Berry, *****, the 18th century French court, famous for its opulence, also hid deep genetic shadows, personified by Marie-Louise Elizabeth d'Orleans. Her life truly reads like a Gothic tragedy, a story of enforced marriages and self-destructive coping mechanisms. She was born into a deeply dysfunctional arrangement. Her father, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, was forced to marry his own cousin, Françoise Marie de Bourbon, who was an illegitimate but legitimized daughter of the great King Louis XIV. This was a political solution, an arranged marriage designed to bring the Sun King's bastard line into the legitimate royalty. As the eldest surviving child of this union, Marie-Louise Elizabeth had no real choice in her own future. She was married off, again, to another cousin, Prince Charles of Berry, the third son of the Dauphin. It was a marriage of consolidation, of keeping the political and financial assets within the tight-knit family circle. The genetic echo from her mother's side, the product of a royal legitimate union combined with this cousin marriage on the father's side, created a highly compromised genetic foundation. She became the poster child for the doomed French royal marriages of the era. The chilling statistic, she had 3 children, none of whom survived childhood. This repeated failure to carry a viable heir, coupled with the suffocating political atmosphere, proved too much. Marie-Louise Elizabeth began turning to alcohol at an astonishingly young age. Reports suggest, as early as 14, a desperate attempt to cope with the heavy hand dealt to her. Her life ended in her early 30s, marked by scandal, excessive behavior, and the overwhelming failure to secure her line. Her tragic tale is a dark illustration that the Bourbon-Orleans commitment to dynastic duty, secured through consanguinity, lead only to sorrow and the eventual obliteration of her branch of the family tree. It is easy to dismiss these stories as archaic curiosities, confined to the distant past and the bizarre rules of royal courts. But the profound truth, the most important lesson of this tragic history's, that genetic law is universal. It cares nothing for crowns, titles, or wealth. The same biological arithmetic that plagued Maria Antonia of Austria, who had an F-score of over 0.25, is at work today in isolated, non-royal populations across the globe. The stories of figures like Lorraine Whittaker and Kimberly Colt, though profoundly distressing, serve as a stark, modern counterpoint to the royal saga. The Whittaker family in the Appalachian region of the United States and the Colt family in rural Australia, who lived in deep isolation, practiced what amounted to multi-generational endogamia, closed-loop community, with virtually no outside genetic input. Their isolation was not chosen for political power, but simply due to geography and cultural separation. Yet, the genetic outcome is identical to the Habsburgs. When the families were documented, they became case studies in the darkest consequences of unchecked inbreeding. Lorraine Whittaker and her son Timmy, stand out as individuals documented as being severely genetically affected, terrifying, living reminder that the invisible accumulation of recessive traits leads to the same biological outcome, whether the subject is living in a palace or a forgotten hollow. Their existence proves that the tragedy of history's most inbred women is not just a royal problem. It is a human problem that is governed by unchanging biological principles. The pursuit of purity, whether political or cultural, inevitably leads to the same genetic compromise. ***, we have journeyed from the brother-sister unions of the Nile under the Ptolemies, through the twisted web of the Habsburgs that created figures with the genetic load of full sibling children, and finally to the doomed, troubled minds of the Bourbons. These women, Cleopatra II, Maria I, Maria Antonia, and Isabella II, were born into a system that valued the concept of the dynasty above the reality of the individual. They were instruments of statecraft, their wombs, political territory, and their genetics, the price of admission. Their lives are the cold, final evidence that the most powerful families in human history, armed with armies, treasuries, and divine right, could not defeat the simple, implacable laws of biology. They gambled their children's minds and bodies on the political goal of consolidation, and they lost spectacularly. Their legacy is not just one of grand titles and faded empires, but of disease, death, and profound personal suffering. Their stories remind us that history is shaped not just by politics or war, but by the invisible, cumulative hand of biology and blood. These were the women who bore the heaviest weight of their family's calculated ambition, demonstrating once and for all that in the pursuit of the purest bloodline, what they created was something far, far darker. The crown was paid for with a debt of DNA, and the interest on that debt was catastrophic.